Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the PES Geek Podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and PES Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, PES Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the PES Geek Podcast family. This podcast is for those who are interested in vertebrate pest control with a twist. We tend to get a deep dive down into some technical information, so if you're looking for something beyond the ordinary to really add depth to your understanding of wildlife control, then this is the podcast for you. So glad to have you with us. I'm now recording after Thanksgiving, so I hope your Thanksgiving went well. Mine was uneventful, which is certainly fine. So here we are running toward the end of the year, 2023. I hope it was good for you in that you're looking forward to 2024. So hopefully that'll be a better year than this one. So thinking about a topic. So, of course, you can always suggest topics to me. You can reach me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. That's WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com to suggest topics. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk about things that are of interest to me and that I find sort of unusual and quirky, that would be something out of the ordinary. Today I thought I would do something a little bit more quote-unquote practical. Those of you that have been following the podcast know that I do take some issue with the idea of practicality because it's often based on a very narrow time range. I mean, how many of us were in high school and we would yell at our teachers, when are we ever going to use this? And then when we get older, we find out, oh my gosh, it really would have been useful to really know that better, right? So we can't always know what information is going to be quote-unquote practical down the road, right? So a lot of times there's a little bit of anti-intellectualism and a little bit of arrogance there sometimes that you see sometimes within our industry. But nevertheless, this is certainly, I would think, has immediate practicality for many of you because we do encounter what we know as trap-wise animals. So thought I would talk about that today. I do hope that you would enjoy it. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you're notified of upcoming or new postings on our podcast. You can also download my podcast from Rumble. That would just go to Wildlife Control Consultant and you can find my podcast there. I typically post there sooner than it's posted on the other site. So nevertheless, we can certainly move on here. Well, let's talk about trapping trap-wise animals. Well, if you've been involved in the wildlife control industry for any length of time, you will encounter situations where animals, for some reason, aren't going into the trap. And it becomes a little bit of a challenge for figuring out what is going on and how can you convince that animal to go into the trap. And so I think that this problem is more common in certain parts of the country than others. It's just my sense. I think that areas that have a lot more trapping activity are going to encounter this, particularly in areas where you're getting people who are trapping animals and then translocating them, that is, dumping them somewhere else. And I think this is certainly going to be an issue for many of you. And it can really be quite costly if you're determining that an animal that you're trying to control is just not going into the trap for whatever particular reason. So we want to be sure that we're distinguishing this from sometimes when we're trapping a particular animal situation, there's no animal to catch. That is, sometimes the animal just simply sees a trap there and bugs out, or maybe gets hit by a car that night, or who knows. and you're trying to capture an animal that's no longer there. I'm not talking about that situation. This is why it's so important when you are doing structural wildlife control that you have an idea of whether the animal's moving in and out of that building or not. And that should be, you want to make sure you know whether that animal's moved, because sometimes you don't capture an animal because it didn't move. I talked to one wildlife controller and he said the raccoon was denned up in a house for a month. Okay, so that's a lot of trap checks. Okay, so we're not talking about that scenario per se, although there probably was some trap wiseness in his situation. I'm talking more generally here about situations where you put a cage trap out or a box trap out and you just can't seem to get the animal inside of it. So let's talk about that here briefly. First, we want to talk about some definitions, and here I tip my hat off to Ron Jones. Ron Jones is he's been in the industry for a pretty long time. He has a wildlife control company in New Jersey, but you may know him for his bait work, and he has what's called ACP Wildlife Control Services, ACP Redneck's Pride. That's his bait line, ACP Redneck's Pride. So he didn't pay me to put this up here. I just wanted to acknowledge that his definitions, or his terminology, I should say, is from trap shy and trap wise. So he distinguishes those two concepts, and I think he has a point there. He's a pretty sharp guy. We've had him on the podcast. You can certainly go back and listen to one of my interview with him. And so he distinguishes trap shy from trap wise. Trap shy is basically an animal who's just afraid of the trap, perhaps because it's new, he didn't see it there before, but he really doesn't know what it is. He's just avoiding it. That he would call a trap shy. A trap wise animal is an animal that knows what it is and is deliberately avoiding it. Or he could even screw with it. Situations where a raccoon is able to walk into a cage and realizes that the treadle is the dangerous part, and then will reach over and grab bait and not touch the treadle because he's figured it out. And that's a trap-wise animal. So we're not really going to go down the rabbit hole here in the sense of how do you tell whether your animal's trap-wise or trap-shy and go down to that. So because that would take more time than you would probably want to spend in the field to determine that. But it is something to keep in the back of your mind, and that is sometimes, because trap shyness is often overcome simply with time. Those of you that try to trap rats know that if you have established rats in an area and you put a trap out or a bait station, it can take some time for the rodents to interact with those materials. That's really an indication of trap shyness or device shyness, what we call neophobia, fear of new things. They don't know what it is, as opposed to a rat that actually takes debris and pushes it onto a trap to bury it because he knows what it is. And so that's the difference between a trap shy and a trap wise. Well, whatever the reason that the animal is not going into the trap, we have some tips here to give you on how to overcome that particular problem. And so for some of this is going to be a trap-wise situation, to be sure. Okay. The tip number one, if you're finding, that the animals are not going in, maybe the client's calling you and say, I saw the animal step by the trap and he knew what it was a trap, whatever the case may be. Excuse me. So one of the things you're finding after several days, you're having activity at the particular location and you're not able to get that animal into the trap, one of the things you can do is perhaps change the trap. That is, if you're using a box trap like the one on the right, switch it to a cage trap, the one on the left. You can even change things like the size of the trap. I had a situation where I could not catch a gray squirrel, and I was like, what is the deal? Gray squirrels are one of the easier animals to trap, and I could not get this gray squirrel to go into the trap. And someone told me, try a bigger trap. So I went to a raccoon-sized trap, caught the squirrel. So now, What I don't know, what I didn't know then, and I know now, we'll talk about that in a tip later, and that is sometimes there's an odor in the trap that's causing hesitation on the part of the animal going in. But assuming that my squirrel trap, because I use my squirrel traps to also trap skunks, and not occasionally I would get a raccoon in them. Pretty weird when you see a raccoon in a 7x7 by 24 inch trap. That's kind of funny actually when you see how packed in they are. But that might have been the reason why I couldn't get a squirrel into that cage trap, but I don't know. But this is so for whatever reason you want to change the trap, you're trying to change that that look to the particular situation. Sometimes it's just simply something as easy as changing the trap or changing the size of the trap. So that's tip number 1. Tip number 2 is change your bait and your baiting technique. This just, whenever we're doing wildlife control, I strongly recommend that we should be using at least 3 traps per site if you're doing a bait trapping technique. And this allows you to have a lot of traps working, but you should be kind of diversifying your bait a little bit, right? You have good location. You always should have good location. Never rely on the bait per se. You should never make the bait do what moving the trap would do. Okay, so that's kind of the rule. But there are situations where when you have all the traps that are in close proximity to another, you shouldn't be using just the same bait. You should be mixing it up a little bit and, of course, keeping records on which bait works better, because you may find that maybe this raccoon or skunk or whatever got trapped before on a particular bait and he's not going in again, right? So remember, there's always going to be outliers when we're dealing with wildlife, and so we have to kind of improve our odds, because wildlife control, of course, is a very time-intensive activity, and we've got to maximize efficiencies whenever we can find them. So use at least 3 traps. You should be mixing up your bait. You should know what you've been using at your particular sites and knowing what you have to do. That if you're getting some resistance, maybe try something, that you hold off. You have your day-to-day, your go-to, but then when things aren't going right, you have to switch it up. Find something different that may be going from, a protein-based bait to a sweet bait to maybe a glandular type lure. I mean, you have to kind of work that out, but you should be looking at something different. Tip number 3 is consider changing the trap's feel. And what we mean by that is that sometimes when an animal walks into a cage, it feels different, and they may have some reticence to continue walking into that particular trap because it's not a natural feel. Now, I'm not making a big deal about this, because a lot of the animals that we control in urban environments, there's all kinds of textures. There's concrete, there's asphalt, there's grass, there's wooded areas, so the animals are feeling a variety of surface textures. But when you think about a cage, that is a very different feel on your feet. And so you may get an animal that recognizes, I've had a bad experience with this feeling in my feet before, and I don't want to walk in. Well, there are ways to simply resolve that. Put some newspaper down. Sometimes people will take loose soil and fill the bottom of the trap all the way up to the treadle. Make sure you don't interfere with your treadle. That'll really screw things up, right? But you want to make sure that it's sort of like that the animal's walking from one texture to the same texture. They're just doing it inside of the box. Other things that you can do to change the trap's feel is if you're using a cover, and I always recommend you use covers with your cage traps in particular, that maybe if you're having resistance is you use it without a cover. Or you change the look and feel of the cover. Maybe rather than covering the back end completely, maybe you would just simply make it like a tube so the animal sees light coming out of the back end, as opposed to you're changing something about how that is perceived. Maybe going to a round trap. There's the snare shop has those PVC pipe skunk traps. Maybe those are round. That has a different look rather than being what they call square shy, right? So those are some things you'd want to think about that you'd have in your in your toolbox to say, okay, I'm dealing with an animal that's just not going into the trap, so let me switch it up a little bit on them. Tip number 4 is use a clean trap. Now that's sort of a subsetting of the first tip I gave you, that is switch traps, but this is where the trap is not a problem. It's that there's some sort of odor on that trap, that problem. Now this is something that may become more and more of an issue down the road, but there's some guys who will clean their metal traps. Don't do this with a plastic catch, of course, okay? But they'll flame them. Now you're not, just to be, get a little sidebar here when we talk about flaming your trap, you're not flaming them so they glow, okay? You're just taking that propane weed burner and you're just wanding across the trap. You're trying to burn off the hair of the previous animal, volatilize any of the pheromones, body oils that have been on it. And so you're making it warm, but you don't want to make it so it glows. That's going to really degrade your metal. And of course, always make sure you're following proper fire safety, right? You want to be doing this on a surface that's not burning, like, maybe concrete. You want to be away from volatile materials, and you always want to keep your wits about you when you're doing this, and you're doing it in full safety. I would recommend even having, a fire extinguisher nearby. So you just want them, they burn very hot. And they can burn you, of course, but you also don't want to cause a fire. Now, for those of you that can't use this or don't want to use this, some people will use, garden hoses, and they will just spray down their traps and let them sit outside for several days to kind of let them, air out, and those odors volatilize off, and then you just simply create a swap out cycle. And, but sometimes you want to keep, just as another sidebar, sometimes you want to keep a trap as with odor. Say if you have a female skunk and she was in heat and you caught her, well, that's going to be a hot trap for, trapping male skunks. Okay, so this is something, you have to this is why it's so important to keep track of what you're trapping with. So whether you're cleaning with water or soap or something, or whether you're cleaning with fire, be careful, be cognizant of where your wastewater is going, be cognizant of where the fire is going. For those of you that are trying to clean some of your plastic catch traps, those sort of solid, your box traps, you can use things like Lysol liquid. And again, just think about where that wastewater is going to go, and make sure when you're spraying, you want to make sure you watch for splashback, right? So you want to make sure you're keeping your mouth closed, or maybe get a full face shield. I heard a story once about a guy. He was, courting this woman, and her father was a pig farmer, and, they're trying to learn. He's trying to, ingratiate himself with the family because he wanted to propose to her, and the father brought him out to clean the pig stall. And to do that, use a high pressure washer. And the farmer told him, keep your mouth closed. Well, he had, didn't do it perfectly. And he was spraying, of course, some of that backwash came back and went into his mouth. So this is something you want to be careful, of course, when we're cleaning cage traps with liquids and that sort of thing. You want to be careful of splashback, right? So watch your mouth. So that's tip number 4. Take care of that odor issue. And then, of course, lastly, the last tip I'm going to give you here is change the set. So this means you go from a baited set, and maybe you want to move to a blind set, the picture on the right. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with our podcast mess, there's 3 different types of trapping sets. A baited set, that's where you have your trap with bait that lures the animal into the trap. That's a baited set. A blind set is a trap that's set where the animal is going to be moving. That's the one on the right. There's no bait in that trap on the right. It's simply set. It's a 2-door trap set on a trail that where the animal simply walks the trail and runs right into the trap. That's called a blind set. The last set's what's called a positive set. That's the one on the left. And the positive set is it's called positive because you're positively catching the guilty animal. That's where you're putting the trap over the opening, so the only thing you're going to catch is the animal coming out of the hole. That's called a positive set, because you're positively catching the guilty animal. You can't say that if you put a blind set over the hole, and the blind set over a hole is very effective as well, but you don't know whether the animal is coming in from the outside or whether the animal is coming out of the structure from the inside. So there's baited set, blind set, positive set, and if possible, you may need to move to a blind set. And thankfully, there are traps on the market today. The Comstock trap is certainly one that has gotten a lot of positive feedback within the industry because of its ability to be set in a variety of placements and still close, no matter whether it's upside down or vertical. And it's also much smaller than your traditional two-door traps because the doors are so powerful. They work so quickly. So that's the fifth tip when you're dealing with a trap-wise or trap-shy animal, and that is simply change the set. So let's go down that list one more time for you. So the first one is change the trap. Go from a cage trap to a box trap. Maybe put a cover over a cage trap if you didn't have one before. You can also change the bait or your baiting technique. Tip number 3 is change the trap's feel. This is one where you maybe put some newspaper on the floor so the animal doesn't feel the cage, or use soil. You can also change how you're putting your covers over the trap. That's changing how does the trap being perceived by the animal. Maybe going from a square trap to a round trap would be another way of changing the trap's feel. Number 4 is make sure your trap has been deodorized, so there's no foreign odors that may be causing that animal to hold up before he goes into the trap. And then lastly, change the type of set you're using. If you're using a baited set that we've been assuming here today, maybe move over to a blind set or think about using a positive set. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the PES Geek Podcast family. Again, the PES Geek Podcast family, we are all about talking about technical information to help you become a better pest control or pest management professional. So I specialize in vertebrate control. So in my Living the Wildlife, we drill down into unusual information about vertebrate pest control so that you can improve your technique and knowledge on how to manage wildlife damage for your clients. Or if you're a non-professional, you can work as if you're a professional, so you're using the quality techniques so you can get the job done efficiently and responsibly. So I hope you found that interesting. I do hope that you would take a few moments and subscribe to the channel. I do upload material onto Rumble, and you can download my material there as well. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant. You have comments, criticisms, suggestions for new shows. Perhaps you would like to be on the show. You can reach me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you, and perhaps we can talk about having you on the show. Just a reminder, we want to put a shout out, of course, to Ron Jones. Thank him for his tip on his distinction between trap shy and trap wise. Of course, you can learn more about the products he has at ACP Rednecks Pride. So he's out of New Jersey. So if you're interested in some baits, again, he has not paid me for a spot today on my podcast. I'm simply acknowledging that some of that definitional distinction is him, and at least I learned it from him, and so I wanted to give him acknowledgement for that. Again, you can reach me at WildlifeControlConsultant@gmail.com, and again, I would love to hear from you. And you may be wondering, well, why do you call this Living the Wildlife? Well, we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Till next time, take care, everybody.